Hello, I'm Derek Walker. I'm the pastor of the Oxford Bible Church. And right now we're doing a series called Creation, Evolution, Revolution. And this is part 5 of that series. This is such an important subject. It goes to the roots of who we are and life on earth. And we need to understand these issues because there's so many voices telling us that evolution's a fact. And we're not even allowed to debate it or question it. We need to understand these issues for ourselves and for our witnessing. Let me start with a story. There's a little girl who asked her mother, how did the human race appear? The mother answered, well, God made Adam and Eve and they had children and that's how all mankind was made. 2 days later she asked her father the same question and he said, well, many years ago there were monkeys from which the human race evolved. The girl was confused. She returned to her mother and said, Mum, how is it possible that you told me the human race was created by God, and Dad said that they developed from monkeys? The mother answered and said, well, dear, that's very simple. I told you about my side of the family, and your dad told you about his side of the family. Well, we've been challenging the common assumption that evolution is scientific fact. We saw that this is very misleading. And it is just not true. Actually, evolution has never been observed. In the past fossil record or in the present, it's never been observed. And it's really just a hypothesis, which isn't actually supported by the evidence. We saw that, as I said, there's an absence of evidence. In the fossil records, there's an absence of transitional forms. And you can't see upwards evolution happening even now, in real life, even to a small degree. And so we shouldn't give it the status of even a theory, because a theory is something that has at least some kind of supporting evidence to it. Well, any other hypothesis, apart from evolution, that has so much contradictory evidence against it would have been thrown out by now. But there are special reasons why evolution has clung on despite all its problems. Well, last time we thought let's have a good look at the evidence that is put forth for evolution. As we say, there's no direct observational evidence whereby it's been seen to happen. But what about the other forms of evidence for it? And we started to discuss these. First of all, we talked about the fact that there is similarity of forms between many different creatures. We have many things in common, such as DNA. We talked about how that doesn't necessarily mean that everything came from the same original, ancestor. But it can also be explained by the fact that there was one creator who designed all life, and therefore we'd expect a uniformity of the way he did it, as well as a diversity. The second line of evidence we saw was that evolutionists say, well, new species are being formed today. And in fact, what they actually mean by that is that through inbreeding, for example, you can actually create offspring if you do it enough, or if you induce enough mutations, that the new offspring can't mate with the original population, and therefore they then call that a new species. But all of this is all horizontal variation or even downward evolution, devolution. But nothing has been done that has actually created evolution whereby lower life forms actually gain in complexity to higher life forms. So that's misleading. Then we talked about the third line of argument, which they now say many things in the creation have evidence of poor design. And some time ago, not so much now, there was a lot of talk about vestigial organs. And now evolutionists are realizing that these so-called vestigial organs provide no evidence for evolution. Vestigial organs are organs that are meant to be useless, like the appendix. But increasingly they found that, in fact, the appendix has its uses, and all these other organs do have their uses. And so they are not useless as was once thought. Also, we made the point that God's it is true in one sense that our bodies are not perfect. Not everything functions as they ought to, but that isn't because God's original creation isn't perfect. The Bible says that because of sin, corruption, mutations, genetic abnormalities have come in. And so not everything is functioning as it ought to, but that doesn't mean that God didn't make that original creation perfect. And then this argument from bad design actually has gone in a rather perverse direction. And in the program I mentioned last time, Professor Dawkins, on his program, The Genius of Darwin, he used eyes as an evidence against God. He said, our eyes are badly designed, and therefore they must have evolved. And it's incredible to me, of course, because if you know anything about the human eye, you know how amazing its design is, that it's such a strong argument for creation, because there are so many parts working together to create this amazing piece of miniaturized biotechnology that you can't explain it by evolution. It's a great case of irreducible complexity in that you can't explain how it evolved, because so many things would have had to be put in place at the same time for it to even function. And it's so flexible. You can see, it can focus through a tremendous range, automatic focus. It can deal with the changes of light. It can look in the distance. It can look close by. It can look in 3D. You know, the eye is amazing, and nothing that man has done comes even close to the eye. So to use that as an argument against design is absurd, because man is trying to catch up. Man got the idea from the eye for his instruments, and man is still trying to catch up using all his skills as a designer, and still can't come close to what was done in the eye. So how that can be used is really an argument of desperation, you might say, because in fact our eyes are brilliantly designed. And in fact, if we think we can see a flaw in the design of the eye, it's probably because we don't actually understand how it all works properly. And with greater understanding, we'd understand why God did it in that way. But also, this made me think about the general concept of design. And before we criticize any designer, we need to understand that to design something, to do a multitude of tasks and to be flexible and useful, requires getting a lot of things right at the same time. And so you might pick one aspect and say, well, this thing could be better at this. But that's a foolish argument, because you have to look at the whole thing together. Yes, you might improve something here, but it will be at the cost of something else. And so the designer is actually designing something for a purpose, and he puts all those criteria together. You see, anyone designing a finite object has to work within limits and make compromises. What must it do? Should it be specialized to do one task very well, or be adaptable to do many tasks? Many balances have to be made, say between long life and safety, or high performance and a shorter life. You know, something that is necessary to one aspect of its function might impede another aspect. You want a car to go faster, so you've got to strip it out of all the comfort items, you see. So what's important to you? So the designer has to prioritize and balance these things. You know, a Formula One racing car might seem to be a more perfect design than a normal family car, because it can do one thing very well, which is to go very fast. But that comes at the cost of many other things, which have to be sacrificed, like ease of use. I wouldn't even be able to drive it. I'd keep stalling it. Fuel efficiency, safety, comfort, longevity, and so on. And so it would be a terrible car to use in normal life. It would be bad. And the family car, however, which might not seem as spectacular, it balances many factors, is actually far better designed for normal use, even if it seems less perfectly designed when you compare it to a racing car, because, you know, it doesn't go so fast. But if somebody said your car was badly made because it was much slower than a racing car, you would see that that was a fallacy in their argument. And so any kind of argument that says God's design of the body is imperfect because he could have made a certain part with a greater ability to perform some kind of specialized function, that's invalid by itself. Because however well a machine is designed, you could always apply that kind of criticism, you see, but enhancing one aspect of it would actually come at the cost of something else that would probably be more important. And also, the more complex you make things, the more ways it can go wrong. The designer has to find the right balance so that it has the best balance of qualities needed for the function for which it's being made. We might ask, why didn't God give us 3 ears so we could hear better? Or 2 noses to smell better? Or 4 legs to run faster with? And this is just silliness. So, I submit that anyone who cannot see the human body as anything other than an amazing masterpiece of highly complex, advanced design, with many systems working together in harmony, it's way beyond anything man has achieved. It is being deliberately blind, in my opinion. The body is highly adaptable to many different situations, many different demands, multiple systems all coordinated together. It's made to be long-lasting, self-repairing. And on top of that, we're seeing it in its fallen condition. What it would have been like before sin entered the world is beyond our imagination. And in the resurrection, when our bodies will be glorified, it will then enter into the total perfection that God had already always intended. And that's going to be amazing. And so that's the third line of evidence. The fourth line of evidence that evolutionists alludes to is the fossil record. But we saw that actually supports creation over evolution. You see, the creation model predicts a sudden appearance in great variety of highly complex forms. And each basic type of animal will appear with its characteristics complete, and sharp boundaries between the different kinds of animals. It predicts that there won't be any transitional forms as one type of animal changes to another. Evolution, on the other hand, predicts a gradual change of simple forms into more complex forms, with many transitional fossils kind of connecting them, and no systematic gaps. So when we actually look at the fossil record, what do we see? Darwin knew this was the big test, that whether transitional fossils were there or not there would be the big test of his theory. And that means, as a theory, it made predictions, and 150 years later, after looking and finding many, many fossils, we have to say that evolution failed in its predictions. The missing links are still missing on a massive scale. Every place where there should be transitional fossils, there's a gap. Thousands of gaps, thousands of missing links. Surely this is the disproof of evolution. And L.T. Moore said, the more that one studies paleontology, the more one becomes certain that evolution is based on faith alone. And so the so-called evidence claimed for evolution is just not there. It's actually contradicted by the evidence. So you might believe in it, fine, but please don't pretend that it's science. In fact, because of the missing links, evolutionists have had to come up with what's called neo-Darwinism, which basically says evolution didn't happen gradually, but it jumped over those gaps. So in the end, it had to reinvent itself to pass that test. In other words, evolution happened, but it happened in a way that it didn't leave any evidence for it. They can't explain why it jumped, and so it's gone beyond the realm of science because it's not testable. There's no evidence supporting it. So it's just misleading that it's propagated as fact. Well, the game really is up for evolution now, because our knowledge of the fossil record is complete, fairly complete. Had evolution happened, we'd have seen it in the fossil records. The transitional forms would be there. The most obvious explanation why the missing links are missing is that they were never there in the first place. And evolution hasn't been thrown out. The reason is simply that it goes to people's belief systems. And if they reject evolution, they have to accept that there's a God. And often they're not willing to do that. Well, all that evolutionists can do is produce the odd extinct fossil and say, well, this might be transitional. But actually, it's more easily explained as just a variation that's become extinct. There has been no proven transitional form. Nothing has been shown to be a transitional fossil. And so it's as if the fossil record was designed to disprove evolution. That's how it is. Well, we must conclude, therefore, that evolution is just a hypothetical story without any evidential foundation. And now we're going to put the knife in even stronger, because we need to expose another misunderstanding now about evolution. You know, the impression is given that Darwinian evolution by natural selection explains how life began. And so, in many people's minds, that does away with the need for God. But actually, evolution is only a hypothesis that tries to explain naturally how the variety of life forms came from a common origin, from the original life form. However, by its very nature, evolution does not explain how the first life form came into being. Evolution is not a theory for the origin of life. No, it's only a theory for the development of life into higher forms from the original form, by its very definition. You see, natural selection, which is at the heart of Darwinianism, is actually something that only works on living beings that reproduce themselves, and then selection happens on that. But how do you explain how the first life came into being? Evolution cannot explain that. And so you need to understand there are two distinct issues. Number one, how did life begin? Was it by an act of creation, or was it by random processes, whereby chemicals arranged themselves to form proteins and DNA and the first living cell? That's the first issue. How did that happen? Then the second issue is, how do we explain the range of life forms that we see today and in the fossils? Did maybe God create each major type of life form to multiply according to their kind? Or perhaps did all these life forms evolve from the very first cell by natural selection? That's the two issues. But on the issue, we've already discounted it on the issue of evolving life. But on the issue of how did life start in the first place, evolution is dumb and cannot explain that. And that's why that subject is often avoided, because it's the weakest part of their theory. There's this paradox. What came first, the chicken or the egg? I'm not sure what an evolutionist would say to answer that. That's a real problem for them. Whereas the creationist would say, that's easy. The chicken came first, stupid. All right. Well, Darwinian evolution can try and explain how life developed, how man came from the amoeba, but it does not explain the origin of life itself. Those who don't believe in a creator have to believe that life somehow arose spontaneously from that primordial chemical soup. And this is called chemical evolution. That's something different, though. It's chemical evolution. This is different from Darwinian evolution by selection. But unfortunately for evolutionists, chemical evolution is obviously absurd. And it's a proven mathematical impossibility. You see, because now, maybe we didn't know this 50 years ago, but now we know the incredible complexity of even the simplest cell. They used to call it the primitive cell, the simple cell. There's no such thing. The simplest cell is more complicated than the busiest city. Chemical evolution proposes that highly complex proteins necessary for life, like DNA, were formed through random chemical reactions of the naturally occurring elements. Now, it is possible, you see, for us to calculate the probability of such things happening by accident, of DNA somehow forming by accident. And let me tell you, the probability is effectively zero. These things are so complex, scientists can't even come close to doing it deliberately in the lab, let alone seeing them happen spontaneously. It's just absurd when you look at the probabilities. You see, the evidence for design now in the universe is so much greater than before. We've found that the universe is fine-tuned for life. We've discovered that the simplest cell is far more complex than we could have even imagined, making it impossible to explain by natural process, by random processes. Now somebody said this: we now know that the first living cells are far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. The probability of an accidental formation of a single living cell is even smaller. It's hard enough to make these complicated proteins, but now to package all these proteins together into the first living multiplying cell on which evolution can work is just is smaller than zero. There's no such thing, you see, as a primitive cell. And as we discovered more about the complexity of life, the idea of spontaneous generation of life becomes totally absurd. Sir Fred Hoyle, a very famous scientist, was not a believer, but he said this: it's about as likely as an explosion happening in a factory of spare parts and the jumbo jets are suddenly being formed out of that debris and flying out. He worked out the probability of proteins necessary for life being formed by chance somewhere in the universe over billions of years, and it was effectively zero. It could not happen. That's the mathematics of evolution. You know, this fact is avoided by evolutionists. I like what Sir Fred Hoyle said here. He said the odds against this happening, chemical evolution, is enough to bury Darwin and his whole theory of evolution. And he said, the notion that the operating program of the living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial soup here on Earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. I like that. Stephen Grocott of the Royal Australian Chemical Institute, he said, I'm afraid that as a scientist I simply cannot say strongly enough that spontaneous origin of life is a chemical nonsense, and therefore I'm left with no alternative but to believe that life was created. You know, let me tell you what the probability is. An expert in probability, Dr. James Coppedge, he calculated that the chance of a single protein molecule, just one, coming together by chance is 1 in 10 to the power of 161. That's 161 zeros. Now there's 10 to the power 80 atoms in the universe, so it would take 10 to the power of 81 universes for that to happen. If you know about numbers, you know how absurd that is. And so why do people still believe in it, despite the evidence? As a Nobel Prize winner said, Harold Urey, he said, all of us who study the origin of life find that the more we look into it, the more we feel it is too complex to have evolved anywhere. We all believe as an article of faith that life evolved from dead matter on the planet. Harvard's George Wald said, when it comes to the origin of life on this earth, there are only two possibilities: creation or spontaneous generation. There's no third way. Spontaneous generation was disproved 100 years ago. But that only leads us to one other conclusion: supernatural creation. We can't accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life rose spontaneously by chance. Well, at least he's being honest. But this is very different from the idea put around that molecules to man evolution is solidly based on science. Absolutely it is not. This failure by evolution to explain the fundamental issue of the origin of life is its weakest point, its greatest embarrassment, and that's why the subject is avoided. There is no naturalistic theory for the origin of life because of the complexity of even the simplest cell makes it impossible. Therefore, there is only one coherent and viable explanation for the origin of life, and that is creation. Evolution, therefore, is a theory in crisis. Its lack of evidence, its improbability, in contrast to the great evidence for intelligent design. And despite this, the establishment acts as if it's fact. Not because of the evidence, but because the alternative is a supernatural creator, and that's unacceptable to them. Well, it's rejected in our godless society because evolution is a necessary part of any belief system that arises from a rejection of God as a creator. Evolutionists want us to believe many impossible things at once. First, DNA and single-cell organisms just happened by accident. And then random processes took us from amoeba to men. This is absurd. And this should lead us to consider the claims of the alternative, that there is a creator God who made everything, and that he told us about it in the Bible. And we will now go on in this series to look at creation and see if that makes sense.